Good afternoon and welcome to the T-Levels Funding Explained webinar. My name is Peter Clark and together with my colleagues Nick Thatcher, Elizabeth Baines and Sarah Knights, we'll take you through the government's proposals for allocating funding for T-Levels, as set out in the T-Levels Funding Consultation document published in November. We'll take you through the proposals for funding bands, industry placements funding, the funding arrangements for English and Maths, the formula factors and the local offer. We won't go through every detail included in the funding consultation document, but we will try and draw out the key points that we hope will be helpful. These are proposals for consultation, not a final position, and we're currently seeking views on them. After the presentation, we'll be answering the questions you've submitted to the panel. Many of you have already submitted questions when registering, but if you'd like to submit a question live during the webinar, you can do so on the right-hand side of your screen. The funding proposals for T-Levels are part of a programme of work to reform and strengthen technical education. The Wolf Report in 2011 recommended fundamental reforms to funding and accountability systems to promote more effective vocational education. It led to the current funding formula introduced in 2013. The Sainsbury Report and subsequent publications led to plans for T-Levels. The Sainsbury panel sought to learn from successful systems of technical education overseas. Those examined all had bigger, more stretching college-based options than England, in each case operating as an alternative to apprenticeships. This led to the government's decision to create this type of programme in England, the T-Levels, and to support these bigger, more stretching programmes with additional resources. In March 2017, the Chancellor announced that extra funding would be available, rising to an extra £500 million per year when T-Levels were fully rolled out. This would support additional taught hours plus substantial industry placements. That autumn, there was an announcement of up to £20 million of this to support teachers in preparing for T-Levels. This is being used to attract industry professionals into FE teaching through our Taking Teaching Further programme, and it will also be used to provide tailored professional development targeted at teachers who will be teaching T-Levels. Last year we had an announcement of £38 million of capital funding for the first T-Level providers to help them put in place the facilities and equipment they need. Details of how this will operate were published last week. And now we've set out for consultation proposals on how T-Levels provision will itself be funded. We raised some issues about funding in the original T-Level consultation exercise. The results of that have fed through into the more detailed funding consultation. These are the firm points around which we've tried to design the approach. Rather than having a separate funding system for T-Levels, we've set out proposals to reform the existing national funding formula so it can distribute funding for T-Levels as well as for other study programmes. We'll provide the extra funding in the year it's needed, so providers don't have to wait a year to get the extra money for T-Level students, then moving back over time to the normal lagged approach of providing funding based on previous student numbers. And we've built in extra funding for Maths and English hours in addition to the normal hours for those who need them. I'll now hand over to Nick, who will talk to you about the funding bands.
Thank you, Peter. And it's good to have the opportunity to talk about these T-Level funding issues. I'm going to cover the funding bands and funding rates. Regarding the number of funding bands, we know that different T-Level subjects will be of different sizes, so we've proposed a number of funding bands, as shown on this slide. This is in contrast to other study programmes, where there is one full-time funding band, funding for 600 hours a year, but with a standard minimum of 540 hours a year. I want to point out that the funding bands and hours set out in the consultation document just cover supervised or taught hours, and we've used the term planned hours. The planned hours therefore exclude industry placements, which will be funded separately. The funding bands also exclude Level 2 Maths and English, which will be funded in addition to this where students need it. And clearly, T-Level programmes will be bigger than current study programmes. We have therefore set these funding bands with a higher number of hours and higher funding rates. The funding rates are based on the current rate of £4,000 a year, but uplifted on a pro rata basis to reflect the greater number of hours. So taking a Band 7 programme, for example, the average planned hours would be 1,450 hours over 2 years. That equates to 725 hours on average per year. We have worked out the funding rate for this by dividing £4,000 by 600 hours to arrive at the hourly rate of £6.67, and then multiplying that by 725 hours, which comes to £4,833 a year, rounded up to £4,835, as per the consultation document and as shown on the slide. We have followed the same approach for bands 6, 8 and 9 as well. We have, however, set the minimum number of planned hours that would trigger a particular band at a lower level. In Band 7, for example, you can see from the slide that the minimum hours are 1,350 hours. And this reflects the principle applied in current study programmes, which are funded for 600 hours a year, but a minimum of 540 hours triggers the full-time funding rate. I also want to illustrate what we have allowed for when considering a typical or average T-Levels programme in terms of planned hours. The main part of planned hours will unsurprisingly be the technical qualification, but we have also allowed time for employability, enrichment and pastoral, known as EAP, hours, and any other specified requirements that are essential for that T-level. This slide shows an example of a Band 7 programme, and the 1,450 average hours I mentioned a few minutes ago are made up of 1,250 hours for the technical qualification, 50 hours for additional requirements in this example, and 150 EAP hours. Again, these hours cover the 2 years. And this doesn't mean that half the planned hours have to be delivered in each year. Providers will be able to deliver more than half the planned hours in the first year if the industry placement took place in the second year, for example. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this way around. The key thing is that we're thinking of these programmes as 2-year programmes, and the programmes can be designed flexibly over the 2-year period. And obviously this slide is just an example, and there'll be many variations in practice. For example, a different T-level programme in this funding band could have a smaller technical qualification and or fewer EAP hours, and may therefore end up perhaps at 1,350 hours in total, and that would reach the minimum hours for this band. There are a few other comments on the funding bands I want to make. Firstly, just to point out that we do expect that any additional essential requirements that are needed for a specific T-level and that need planned taught hours will be included in the technical qualification. So this will mean they are then included in the hours for that technical qualification and will be placed in the appropriate funding band to cover the cost of these hours for these additional requirements. We can't be specific about this yet because the technical qualifications are still being developed, but we will be working alongside the qualification development process to identify any relevant requirements. Also, you may have noticed from the consultation document that we plan to fund 18-year-olds at the same rate for T-levels as we will for 16 and 17-year-olds. And we propose this extra funding for 18-year-olds because T-level programmes will require a fixed set number of hours for the qualifications, etc., whatever age the student is. Moving on to the placement of T-levels into funding bands. You will have seen in the consultation document that we plan to place each T-level in one of the bands. We have provisionally allocated the first 3 T-levels to funding bands as shown in the document. This provisional allocation is based on estimates of the eventual size of the technical qualifications for these 3 T-levels. But obviously we will keep this under close review with the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education as the technical qualifications are developed. and we plan a similar approach for subsequent T-levels in future waves. We think these proposals for funding bands are a logical and sensible approach, building on and adapting a system and set of principles that work well for other study programmes.
I will now provide you with details of how we propose to fund industry placements from when T-levels are first delivered in the 2020-21 academic year. First, I want to reiterate an important point here. The completion of a substantial industry placement will be a requirement for full certification of the T-levels. Without this, students don't get their full T-level certificate. This is why we brought in the Capacity and Delivery Fund to begin paying for industry placements before T-levels, so that providers would be ready to deliver what is a significant change to what has been traditionally delivered as work experience. We propose funding industry placements for students on T-levels at an indicative set rate of £550. As a T-level is a 2-year programme, we're not being prescriptive for when the industry placement should be delivered across the 2 years. The provider has the flexibility to consider how the placement will fit into the classroom delivery and with employer availability. We will allocate half the funding in the first year and half in the second year. As with the other T-level funding, we propose providing the funding for the year that the student is studying and revert to lagged arrangements in the future. The precise arrangements for when lagged arrangements will start is still to be determined. From that point, we will be making the second year's funding conditional on the placement being recorded in the data as being completed. Therefore, £275 will be deducted from a future year's allocation if a placement is not completed. The example on this slide shows the combination of planned hours and an industry placement for a potential T-level programme. This example covers the whole 2-year period. This is just an example of what a programme might look like, and it doesn't show the further hours and funding that will be provided if Level 2 Maths and/or English is needed to meet the minimum exit requirements, or the funding uplifts that will result from formula factors such as programme cost weights. You can see the 3 elements that add up to make the planned hours of 1,450 hours in the first light blue box on the slide. When the industry placement of 350 hours is added to that, the programme in this example is 1,800 hours. The slide also shows the amount of funding on the right-hand side, that is, the Band 7 rate of £9,670, plus the industry placement funding of £550, which comes to a total of £10,220 before formula factors. However, we do intend to split the funding so that it is allocated on an annual basis. This slide shows the same example programme as the previous slide, but is split out into the 2 years. The 2-year split is purely an example and not an illustration of how the programme should or must be provided. You can see that in this example, Year 1, which is in the top half of the slide, has 800 hours, but none of the industry placement. The remaining 1,000 hours are delivered in Year 2, as shown on the bottom half of the slide, but Year 2 only has 650 planned hours, with the remainder being made up of the 350-hour industry placement. Again, the funding is shown on the right-hand side of the slide, and you can see that the overall funding of £10,220 before formula factors is split so that £5,110 is available in each year. Having stated that a student will not get their full T-level certificate unless they complete the industry placement, The annex to the consultation document includes detail for how we are dealing and defining the completion. Completed status can be withheld in the following circumstances, unless it's for reasons outside of the control of the student. So that is, where the student has failed to attend the placement for 45 working days or not attended for the full 315 hours required as a minimum, or where the student has been given the opportunity to demonstrate the relevant skills and/or theoretical knowledge and has failed to do so, or where the student has been given the opportunity to demonstrate the behaviours and they haven't done so. Changes to both the ILR and the school census will be made to accommodate recording the completed status.
In the wider T-Levels consultation that was launched at the end of 2017, we received a positive response to the idea that Level 2 Maths and English would be funded on top of the hours required for the T-Level itself. This approach was confirmed in the government's published response to that consultation last year. It has since also been confirmed that the minimum exit requirement for T-Levels will be either a Grade 4 GCSE or a pass at Level 2 functional skills. And the condition of funding, which requires providers to continue to teach English and Maths, therefore won't apply to T-Levels. It is not needed because the minimum exit requirement is the main incentive. And it was announced in the T-Levels Action Plan in December last year that the Maths and English exit requirement for some T-Level students with special educational needs, such as those with an education, health and care plan, will be entry level 3 in functional skills, as long as the provider holds an assessment indicating that the student is not able to study these subjects at Level 2. We are pleased that we have been able to propose that a further £750 of funding will be available for the teaching of Level 2 Maths and English, per T-Level student and per subject. This additional funding means that providers won't need to find the funding for Maths and English from their overall T-Levels funding allocations, and that students who need to study Maths and/or English won't have to miss out on other aspects of their study programme for funding reasons. Our proposal is that this Maths and English funding would be a one-off payment made in the first year, whether the student needs to continue in the second year or not. I will come back to this point in a minute, but first I want to explain how we calculated the £750 payment. In order to calculate the rate, we have taken into account the hourly funding rate, the number of hours to be funded, and the GCSE pass rate, to indicate how many students will only need to study Level 2 Maths and English for 1 year and how many will need it for both years of a T-Level. We worked out the hourly funding rate by dividing the 16 to 19 base rate of £4,000 by the 600 study programme hours. This comes to £6.67 an hour. We propose to set the funding at 70 hours per subject per student, because that will allow sufficient teaching time over 2 years for a single GCSE qualification of 120 hours, or over 1 year for a functional skills qualification of 55 learning hours. At a rate of £6.67 an hour, funding for 70 hours, that is covering 1 year, would be £470. However, some students will need to carry on studying Level 2 Maths or English in the second year of their T-Level. Considering the GCSE pass rate by the end of Year 1 for current Level 3 technical students, the rate needs to be £750. So based on current pass rates, £750 allows enough funding for each student who needs to study for a second year to have 70 hours in their second year as well as the first year. We did consider the idea of funding Maths and English separately in each year, but I propose a one-off payment of £750 in the first year, so that all the funding is available straight away. By allocating the Maths and English funding in the first year, we are giving providers guaranteed upfront funding, with no clawback if students leave. Providers can then choose to use it in the way that best suits the needs of their students and their local circumstances. We expect that in practice the numbers will be low. Most students starting T-levels will already have a GCSE in Maths and English, or at least with one of the subjects, with good prospects of obtaining Level 2 in the other. So, overall, our T-levels funding proposals set out that funding for T-levels is made up of a funding rate per student, payments for industry placements, and where students need it, additional funding for Maths and/or English. In addition to this, we intend to apply funding formula factors in a similar way to how we do at the moment.
Through the T-level consultation, it was clear that providers are keen that we build on the current post-16 funding methodology. And we have done this, and this slide shows the post-16 funding formula, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. You will see that included in the formula are additional elements that will be specific to students on a T-level. I will point out the particular elements that may be different from the funding for study programmes. Later this year, following the consultation, we will be issuing full detail for how we will fund T-levels. The following is a high-level description of our proposed approach. For the calculation of student numbers, for early delivery, we will ensure that the funding will be allocated for the year of delivery outside the lagged student number methodology. We will ask institutions to provide us with the numbers of T-levels that they are planning to deliver annually from the 2020 to 2021 academic year. Alongside that, we will also use historic data, using criteria that match equivalent T-levels as closely as possible. We have still to determine whether we will apply a process where institutions deliver more or less than the estimated numbers. In the long term, we intend to include T-level students in the lagged student numbers. With regard to our proposals for how student retention will be calculated, as I have already mentioned, T-levels are 2-year programmes, so we will treat T-levels for retention in the same way as for current 2-year programmes, in that students that complete their first year will attract full funding for that year, that is, when they reach a set point at the end of the academic year. For the first year of delivery of T-levels, we will apply the existing institution level retention factor. Programme cost weights are used to recognise that some programmes cost more to deliver than others. The programme cost weight is not intended to provide additional funding relating to the size of the programme. The additional funding bands will do that. Annex B of the T-level consultation document shows the current programme cost weightings mapped against each T-level. We do not know yet whether these programme cost weights are appropriate for T-levels, and will undertake a piece of work over the coming months. This work will identify whether there is the need to make any changes to the programme cost weights for T-levels, and to consider if there is a better way to distribute the funding available, rather than increasing the money for programme cost weights. The funding formula slide shows that the additional funding for industry placements and for Level 2 Maths and/or English funding for eligible students would not attract programme cost weighting. As Nick has already mentioned, there is additional funding for providers to deliver Maths and English to those students that do not have a Grade 4 GCSE in Maths and/or English or a Level 2 functional skill by the start of their T-level. This funding does not replace disadvantage funding. We propose including the funding after programme cost weighting, as currently Maths and English provision does not attract a programme cost weighting uplift. The additional Maths and English funding will also be uplifted by area cost allowance to meet the additional cost of this provision for institutions in higher cost areas of the country. The current arrangements for calculating disadvantage funding for T-level students will apply, recognising that the purpose of disadvantage funding is to help attract, retain and support disadvantaged students and those with learning difficulties and/or disabilities. T-level programmes will be more demanding and have on average more hours than other study programmes. Therefore, we propose to provide more disadvantaged funding in line with the extra hours to allow providers to extend their support for T-level students. Although we anticipate that the numbers of students choosing to take an additional A-level as well as their T-level will be small, we want to provide the opportunity for when that is in the student's best interest. There are rigorous criteria for when the large programme uplift will be paid for when a student is studying 1 or 2 A-levels on top of their study programme. Students on T-levels who achieve the minimum grade required will attract an indicative amount of £800 for the 2-year period for a single additional A-level. If exceptionally a student takes 2 A-levels in addition to their T-level, an uplift of £1,600 over 2 years will apply. The exact grading structure has yet to be determined. The provider will receive the additional funding in a future allocation, as we will need to wait for attainment data. Funding will be available where providers expand the number of students taking Level 3 Maths. As in the case of large programme uplift, the current criteria relating to students on study programmes will apply.
In this section, I'll talk to you about how we propose to ensure that T-level provision is responsive to local skills needs and ensures that student choice and opportunity is not limited. We refer to this as the local offer. The design of T-level content will be employer-led and tailored to meet the skills needs of their industries. A key necessity of T-level provision is that it is responsive to the needs of local areas. We know that there is a strong link between skills development, local economic growth and earning power, and want to make sure that the T-levels offered by providers reflect both local and national skills requirements. The inclusion of the industry placement will ensure employer engagement in T-levels and strengthen the relevance to the local labour market. We know that many providers of T-levels are already talking to local employers and other local bodies in the public and private sector about the skills needs of their business and, of course, to set up industry placements. We are keen to encourage providers to continue doing so. We want to build on these relationships and promote the good practice that already exists. And importantly, we want to make sure that there is a level of consistency across the country. The cornerstone of our approach is that it should be a two-way process, one that supports and strengthens existing good practice. We are working to put in place skills advisory panels in each mayoral combined authority or local enterprise partnership area. These bodies will provide the expertise needed to address any skills shortages. They will support high-quality analysis and strengthen links between employers and skills providers so that local provision, including T-levels, delivers the skills employers require at local and regional level. We will set the clear expectation in funding agreements that T-level providers should have regard for the skills analysis and any local plans or strategies published by the Skills Advisory Panel. But we also understand that there are many factors that influence a provider's offer to young people: geography, size of the institution, the mission or specialism of the institution, for example. It can also be influenced by a particular type of local business. We will ensure that the skills advisory panels take proper account of providers' circumstances when drawing up their plans, so that they are not expecting local providers to do what is not feasible. Our guidance to panels will be clear on this point. Where there is no local agreement on how T-level delivery will be put in place to meet significant skills gaps or emerging new priorities, local bodies will be able to use the established ESFA process for filling gaps in local provision. None of this will be new to our providers. We know it happens already in the majority of areas. What we are seeking to do is to formalise and build on existing good practice. There is, of course, a balance to be struck between the needs of the local labour market and what young people want to study. We know that young people want to have the skills that will get them a good career in the future. We believe that effective careers advice and guidance is vital in helping young people choose the path that is right for them. This is at the heart of our career strategy, through which we will ensure that students should have access to a wide range of available information, including local opportunities. As you know, many students will take their further education in one place and when older will live in another. It is important, therefore, that we do not restrict provision to only local requirements. We want providers to be able to deliver a broad offer. We believe that the approach that we have set out in the T-Levels funding consultation strikes the right balance between providers offering a range of T-Levels locally that meet local and regional skills priorities, whilst at the same time allowing providers to take account of other factors such as student choice, breadth of provision and social mobility.
Well, before taking some questions, I just wanted to mention our next steps on the funding arrangements for T-Levels. The funding consultation will close on the 19th of February and we plan to publish the government's response in June. We plan to publish the detailed funding arrangements in the summer, along with indicative T-level funding allocations for the 2020 providers. Firm allocations for the 2020 providers will follow by the end of March 2020, and that's in line with the usual 16 to 19 funding timetable. In parallel, we're continuing to develop the actual T-levels, so we'll continue to check that the funding arrangements are suitable in light of those emerging programmes. As the Minister for Skills, Anne Milton, says in her introduction to the consultation, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get technical education for our young people right, and your support is crucial to the success of this programme. Your views on the proposed funding arrangements are really important to us, and if you haven't done so already, please do respond to the funding consultation. And now to some questions. So, we'd like to kick off with this one, which I think, Sarah, might come your way, and it's again about industry placements. We've heard a lot from Elizabeth about the support for providers, but this question is saying, in terms of employers, what will be done by the government to incentivise and encourage more organisations to take on work placement students? In a number of industries, they're saying that they find it tough to get 1 week of work placement for students, let alone 45 days.
Yeah, good question, Peter, and one that we've been asked a few times. So we're putting a lot of support in place, but it's probably worth me picking out a couple of specific things that we're doing. So firstly, we have invested £5 million in the National Apprenticeship Service to provide support and guidance to employers, and that includes a matching service. So what the National Apprenticeship Service is doing is compiling a database of providers and students who are looking for industry placements and matching those up with employers who are able to offer those placements. And the second thing that I wanted to mention was that in late autumn we undertook a series of roundtables with employers. Around about 160 employers attended. We got an enormous amount of feedback through those roundtables that we're now considering, and we expect to publish some guidance on that in the coming months.
Great, thanks very much. So The next question is again about industry placements. Will funding be affected if a student only achieves the T-level qualification and not the placement requirement? And if so, how will it be calculated? Elizabeth, you dealt with this to a certain extent in your presentation.
Yes, so the funding for the T-level qualification will not be impacted by the student not achieving their placement. However, ultimately, when T-level students are incorporated into lagged student numbers, as I've explained, half the funding of the T-level, so therefore £275, would be removed from the provider's allocation at some future point rather than in the year that it doesn't happen.
So it has that sort of consequence later. Okay, the next question is about the funding rate for the hours, and it says, why is the funding rate considerably less per taught hour than study programmes, which in the view of the person posing the question are already insufficiently funded? Most colleges deliver between 300 to 450 hours of staff time on the main qualification, whereas T-levels are requiring 725 taught or supervised hours. And this questioner really can't see a way to afford to deliver them at the proposed consultation rate. Nick, I hope you can respond to that one.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, we do recognise that current study programmes can include hours that are timetabled and supervised as part of a programme, but aren't directly strictly taught. For example, tutorials, project work, enrichment, and of course, work placements. The T-levels have separate arrangements for industry placements. But as with current study programmes, it will be, for providers to decide how to deliver them and how to make best use of the planned hours. We do recognise that the minimum hours requirement in the consultation document for T-levels is slightly higher than for current study programmes compared to the sort of average hours, and that does have an implication. And we'll consider all the responses we receive to the T-levels consultation, and we do plan to look at the overall level of 16 to 19 funding rates as part of the next spending review.
Thanks very much. And just to reiterate, really, again, if there's anyone out there who hasn't yet responded to the consultation, please do that, and we value that very much. So the next question, when T-levels start, will they be the only vocational qualification choice for students, or will there be any other options for a 16 to 19-year-old student who wants to take a vocational qualification other than a T-level qualification? And Sarah, I know this is an area where there's a lot of work going on at the moment.
Yes, in the T-level consultation last year, we proposed that there should be a review of other qualifications at level 3 and below that should be funded alongside T-levels, and we confirmed in the consultation response that that review would go ahead. We are now planning what will be the first of 2 consultations to look at how we go about the approach we should take, the criteria we should adopt, etc. So the honest answer to this question is we don't know. That will depend on the outcome of the consultation, but we propose to launch that consultation in the coming months.
Thanks, and that makes a lot of sense. But just to, I suppose, explain that the T-levels, of course, are being introduced gradually. We've got 3 coming in 2020, a further, and also they'll be rolled out gradually to providers. So the government will be thinking about the phasing of any other action taken on other qualifications, won't it, alongside that? So we wouldn't want to stop qualifications when there's no T-level to replace them, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're looking carefully at that. But again, more opportunities to comment in further consultations coming your way later this year.
Absolutely.
This one's about staff development funding. What staff development funding will be made available to colleges wishing to embrace the new T-levels? And when will it be made available to write new curriculum and develop required upskilling of staff? Well, perhaps I can have a crack at this one. So again, it's an area where there's a lot of work underway in the department. We're working with the Education and Training Foundation at how we can make a programme of support available to providers of T-levels, focusing on the first providers, the 2020 and the 2021 providers in particular. And that will include some, the programme is still being developed, but it will include some sort of tailored support and training. So it won't be an allocation of additional money, but it will be the ability to draw on some particular help. And the Education Training Foundation have got a website which explains what they're planning to do there. So we've got a live question coming in now from Joe, who's saying, on a T-level, a level 3, can we run the industry placement over the 2-year duration of the course? Who'd like to have a crack at that one?
I think that's easily to answer.
Good one.
Because I think, yes, as we've tried to explain, the provider will have the flexibility to deliver the placement across the 2 years of the T-level. So whatever suits, whatever fits, both the student and the provider.
Great. We like the easy questions in particular. And here's one coming in from Tina. Tina's asking, if a student fails to achieve grade 4 in maths or English, will they fail their T-level? Sarah, do you think you can have a crack at that one?
Yeah. So if a student doesn't achieve a grade 4 in maths or English, or level 2 functional skills pass, because either of those qualifications will meet the exit requirement, then they would not achieve their T-level certificate, but they may well have achieved other T-level components. So, for example, the technical qualification, the industry placement, etc. So they would be given a statement that sets out the components that they have passed, but they would not receive the full T-level certificate.
That's really helpful, and I think I understand from what Nick was saying earlier that if they've got special educational needs and disabilities, then there will be a lower bar, and it would be about the there will be a different qualification that will be relevant.
Exactly, and that aligns with the approach taken with apprenticeships, where there is a different requirement. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much. So a question from Andrew. He's asking. He says that senior managers in that college have attended a conference where it was mentioned that part-time work would count as an industry placement. Is this correct? I think the answer probably is it depends. But Elizabeth, you're best placed to have a go at that one.
I think my response probably would still be it depends. The details of how that could work and how it could be incorporated. But definitely we have outlined the principles of what a industry placement should be. So I don't think we can give a blanket, yes it could. So I think that requires a bit more detail than we can give today.
Yeah. And I think we've also said that employers may or may not choose to pay the students on the placements. It sounds like in that example it was someone who's got a part-time job which is paid. Again, that doesn't affect whether it counts as an industry placement. It's not that you have to pay them, it's not that it has to be unpaid. I think either would potentially count, wouldn't it? Okay. So we've got a colleague in a school in Sheffield who's asked this question. Surely students won't have physical time to complete T-levels and A-levels combinations. Rolls-Royce, for example, like our students to have physics and maths. Will they be able to do this? This is quite a tricky one. And Elizabeth, you stressed, I think, a couple of times in your presentation about how this was an exceptional thing.
Yes.
Do you want to say a little bit about how you see that fitting in, or I don't know if anyone else would like to come in on that one?
Well, I think I could repeat, I suppose, what we've already said. We do think it has to be really, really exceptional. In terms of currently with study programmes, and there are students, which is why the large programme uplift was introduced, because there are some students who need that particular stretch and challenge. So we didn't want to rule it out. But we do definitely think that it's going to be an exception, because some of the larger T-levels would definitely not allow, don't seem to allow a lot of time for either 1 or 2 A-levels.
Can I add something to Elizabeth's response? So it's also just worth saying that in developing the technical qualifications with employers, we are ensuring that any additional content that is required for an occupation, such as additional maths or physics, in the case that was asked about, is included within the technical qualification. So whilst we might currently have employers that are used to seeing that maths or physics content bundled as an A-level, in the future the relevant parts of it could be incorporated within the technical qualification. So that would be a different way of looking at it for employers, but it will mean that students with a T-level are studying the content that's important to employers.
As with so many of this, though, there's a lot of flexibility in the system. That's why we're keen to adapt the current funding system and the current study programme system. So ultimately it is up to providers and students, together with employers, to working out what they want to deliver.
Yeah.
So the next question is about capital. In the consultation document, it says that additional details will be available on capital funding. Has this been published? I think that's another easy one. So yes, last week we published details about how the capital funding for the initial T-level providers, the 2020 providers, will be handled. There's a buildings and facilities grant, and the details of that have been made available. And it also outlines that there will also be some further funding for equipment, which will follow later. Next one is from Paul. He's saying, is it possible to confirm if programme cost weightings will remain the same for T-levels? Elizabeth, again, you touched on this a bit in your presentation. We are going to do some work to look at it. We aren't absolutely sure that the current programme cost weightings are exactly right for T-levels, and as a consequence, some work will be taken to actually explore and think about and identify exactly what the best way is to apply programme cost weightings to T-levels. So I suppose the question is it possible to confirm? And I think at the moment, because the review is going to take place, it isn't possible to confirm. Thanks, Elizabeth, that's helpful. And as we've outlined, we are planning to publish further details later in the year in light of this consultation exercise, so we'll be setting up more then. So it's a question from Adriano, who's saying, is it 315 hours or is it 350 hours for industry placements? Elizabeth, is that you and you again?
It can be. 350 hours are the average hours. 315 hours are the minimum. So that's why there are two different figures. And maybe I didn't make it clear in what I was saying. But yes, 350 is the average. 315 is the minimum for an industry placement.
Thanks very much. That's really clear. Why have you allowed only 75 hours a year for enrichment? Well, that for enrichment, employability and pastoral or non-qualification hours, we sometimes say, don't we? Nick, perhaps you could explain.
Yeah, sure. So the sort of EAP hours, as they're known at the moment, are sometimes used for work experience, sometimes used to help fund maths and English that students need. So both of those elements are funded separately under these proposals. So overall, we sort of settled on a figure of 75 hours. That would allow 2 hours per student per week over the course of the academic year. Now, it may be that some students have more than that, some less. So that's average funding. That's an average hours per student. So the variability within that and that amount of hours per week, bearing in mind the circumstances, I think will cover it. Ultimately, we do have a sort of set amount of funding for T-levels that was agreed with Treasury, and we've had to balance out this sort of quite broad range of proposals, and an increase in one area would mean that it would make another area more difficult, and we thought that was the right decision for these hours.
Right. Thanks very much. But again, it's an area that people might want to comment on in their responses to the consultation,
Of course,
if they've
yes.
got views on that. Yeah, great. And here's a question from Kevin. So he is saying, are you saying that the skills advisory panels will be the final arbiter over whether or not a college can run a particular T-level in the future, presumably through an annual bid process? Shall I have a first go at that, and then other colleagues might want to chip in? I don't think that is what we're saying. What we've set out in the consultation document, as Sarah was summarising, was what we thought might make a sensible new requirement on providers to have regard to the local skills strategies and plans of the skills advisory panels, and for there to be a process whereby, if following that local discussion there was still, in the view of the skills advisory panel, a gap because providers weren't stepping in to deliver something that they thought was really important, there would be a sort of gap-filling process for that. So we certainly aren't envisaging that the skills advisory panels will be able to tell a college that it couldn't run a particular T-level in the future. That's definitely not what we've set out in the proposals. For some of the reasons that we talked about in the presentation about the need for people to equip themselves for all kinds of skilled needs, but we are certainly keen to make sure that there is a local offer which aligns with, where necessary, the sort of local needs and the local strategies. And this will be a very interesting area to consider when we look at the responses to the consultation. And again, a bit like some of the other areas we've talked about, colleagues are busy supporting the rollout of these skills advisory panels and thinking about their role separately. I don't know if anyone else has got anything to add on that one.
I think you've summarised it.
We've covered that one, that's great. Okay, thanks very much. So we've got another question coming in. If T-levels are going to be of different sizes, how will this affect progression from them onto higher education? I think this is a bit of a tricky one. Sarah, do you want to have a go?
So we are currently doing quite a lot of work with higher education institutions and with UCAS to look at how progression from T-levels into higher education might work. I think the initial feedback that we're getting is that beyond the size of a programme the size of 3 A-levels, the additional content that a student is taught doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on their ability to progress into higher education, which is why we've based the UCAS tariff points allocation on a programme the size of 3 A-levels. But it's very much a live issue for us, something that we're talking to universities and other higher education stakeholders about. So I think watch this space would be my answer.
Great, thanks very much. We've got a question in from Kevin, which I think you may have covered in your answer. Will T-levels attract UCAS points? I think it's true to say that in general they will attract UCAS points, but it's up to the individual higher education institution to decide exactly what value they want to give them and how, if they want to accept them.
Yes, that's exactly right. So they will attract points equivalent to 3 A-levels. One of the questions that we're currently looking at is what that means for T-level grading, so there's a discussion to be had there. But as you say, Peter, it is down to individual institutions to set out their own admissions requirements.
Elizabeth, looks like
I just wanted to add that higher education doesn't necessarily mean university, does it?
No,
because obviously progression onto a level 4 or a level 5 in a technical route, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and we think that's probably going to be quite an important way for students of T-levels to progress.
Yes.
We've got a question that's come in from Bucks College Group. The question is about, will there be another round of capital funding for the 2021/22 delivery of T-levels? This is something that we can't confirm at this stage. So the funding that we've got for capital is for the 2020 providers, and we've got as I think Nick mentioned, a government spending review coming up. So we'll have to confirm that at a future point when those decisions about future capital have been made. A question coming from Richard. When is it proposed funding will return to lagged funding? Elizabeth, I know you've been giving this one some thought.
I don't think we can be prescriptive about that at the moment. There isn't a particular point that we can say within, a certain space of time. I suppose we would want to give some reassurance that certainly we're not looking at within, say the first 1 or 2 years. It's not going to be an immediate that the second year of a T-level would revert to lagged funding, but we don't. Lagged student numbers, but we don't really know. Do you want to add anything to that, Nick?
No, I think you summed it up fine. I agree with that. Yeah.
No, that definitely makes sense. And the reason why we're doing it in this way is, of course, to give institutions the money that they need and the confidence that they need in order to deliver T-levels, these bigger programmes. So we need to try and get it right, don't we, in that context, but at the same time shift it into a sort of steady state process where we can go back to a lagged approach. It's another question from Adriano saying that the funding for industry placements at £275 will be paid anyway on the first year, even if all the industry placement is completed only on the second year. Elizabeth, I'm coming to you a lot here, but it's your specialist subject.
Yeah, but yes, that is absolutely right. Our proposal is to fund the £275 in each year of the 2 years, even though the placement might be delivered in the second year of the T-level. Yes.
Great. Okay. And another question from Tina, again about the local offer, I think. So as T-levels are focusing on preparing students for jobs in the local area, is there a plan to continue to provide applied generals so that students can be prepared for jobs outside their area as well? Particularly important in an area where jobs/sectors are limited and in order to ensure social mobility. I think there's a load of really interesting issues here that are definitely at the sort of harder end of the spectrum for us. Maybe I can have a go at starting to break it down, and then we'll see if other colleagues would like to come in. So I think we were saying that they weren't just about necessarily preparing students for jobs in the local area, but that clearly that is important. Sarah's talked a little bit about the qualifications review and whether we will what will happen to apply general qualifications in future is for that exercise and those forthcoming consultations. And I think the final part of that question about where jobs and sectors are limited is perhaps touching on the challenge of providing a industry placement in an industry where then there aren't necessarily very many jobs in that locality, and again that's one question that we are looking at and seeing what more could potentially be done to help that. Clearly the work with the National Apprenticeship Service and with the employers that you described, Sarah, will potentially help with that, but it certainly is a challenge for making sure we deliver T-levels effectively. I don't know if you've got any further thoughts on that to begin with, or...
It's very much something that is under consideration at the moment, this final point about access to industry placements, particularly in areas where opportunities are limited. And there is a lot of work going on at the moment to see how we might be able to accommodate flexibilities within the delivery model. So I think more information will be made available over the year as we undertake further research into this.
Thank you. Right, it looks like we've got time for just a couple more questions. So here's a question from again from a colleague in a school in Sheffield. Is the exit requirement a grade 4 GCSE in English language, in English language or in English literature?
It's English language.
Right, that's nice and clear.
Yep.
Excellent. So here's our last question. It's a question from, I think, an employer colleague from the EEF, and the question is, what support will employers get to be able to offer an industry placement for 3 months? Again, I think, Sarah, this is an area where there's a lot of work and thought.
Yeah, so I talked at the start about the work that the National Apprenticeship Service is doing to provide that sort of very streamlined matching service between employers and providers to try and ensure that students that are looking for industry placements can be matched up with employers. We're expecting that to continue and to really gain some traction over the coming months. It's quite a new initiative, but as it beds in, I think that will become invaluable to employers. And as I mentioned earlier, the roundtables that we undertook with employers towards the end of last year, we're considering all of that, the feedback and the views that they gave us, and we will be publishing some more support and guidance over the next few months.
Great. So it's certainly something that we would expect to say more on.
Yes, absolutely.
Over the coming months.
Yes.
Well, thanks very much, colleagues. But it looks like we're now out of time for the webinar, so we'll need to close the section. We'll publish the slides from today's session and a recording of the event on the Funding Consultation website, and we'll send a link to everyone who booked to attend today's webinar. We're also going to include a link to this information in the next edition of the ESFA update. So I'd like to thank very much Nick, Elizabeth and Sarah for their presentations and for taking those questions on a whole spectrum from the easy to the tricky. And most of all, thanks to everyone who joined the session today, put those very interesting questions to us. So we'll consider all of today's questions and comments as we take this work forward. And of course, we'll be carefully considering all of the responses to the funding consultation. So please make sure you've submitted a response by the 19th of February. Thanks again, everybody, and goodbye.